Before I talk a little bit about Barbara here, I wanted to say we know a number of you will have to leave at 1 o'clock for class, or some maybe closer to 1:30. That's fine. You can just slip out as quietly as you can. We're videotaping this for posterity. So thank you very much. You know, the current theory of leadership involves a triad: leaders, followers, and a shared cause. And yet, as recently as several years ago, when I was doing an article on followership and checked at the Baker Library at Harvard Business School, there was a total of 2 books extant on followership. Robert Kelly's a book on followership, and then Ira Challis. And now here, Josie Bass, knowing that Barbara's book was coming out this past February, rushed into print another book authored by 3 people, including Ira Challis, on the art of followership. So, Barbara, people are watching what your research agenda is. It's really this grossly ignored leg of that stool, of that triad. So, Barbara's contribution is very significant. Barbara, as you all know, is the James McGregor Burns Lecturer here at the Kennedy School. She was also the founding executive director of the Center for Public Leadership from 2000 to 2003. Then for 3 years after that, she's been our research director, and now she serves as our eminence brune here at the center. Blonde. Okay, right. She's held lectureships at a variety of different universities: Fordham, Tufts, Fairleigh Dickinson, George Washington, and Uppsala in Sweden. It has also been Dean of Graduate Studies and Research at Fairleigh Dickinson, and then also at the Center for the Advanced Study of Leadership at the Academy of Leadership at the University of Maryland, and was also the driving force behind the founding of the International Leadership Academy Association, the preeminent professional association of folks involved in leadership studies. So it is Barbara is a treasure here at the Center for Public Leadership, and so it's a delight to have her speak about this book, which is the most recent in the joint imprint we have with Harvard Business Press on leadership for the common good. So, Barbara.
Thank you very much. Poor woman. She's never been at one place for more than a few years. Okay, so let me see here what you guys can see. Well, first of all, those of you who won books, you don't have to read it. Just stay here another hour or so, you don't have to read it. Yeah, so followership. I kid my students, those few bold ones who dare to take a course on followership, and I say, now, did you come to the Kennedy School to learn how to be a follower? And the answer is no. And I say, well, what are you doing here? You know, this leadership thing has gotten out of hand. It's like I'm sort of biting the hand. Can you all see me? Or do you want me to? Is it okay? I'm sort of biting the hand that feeds me. But underlying my presentation today is the supposition that the leadership field, which in its current incarnation is about 30 years old, that is, Machiavelli did leadership, and Plato did leadership, and Lao Tse did leadership, but in its modern incarnation, this fashionable stuff is about 3 decades old. And I really have reached the conclusion that we have become leader-centric, fixated on leaders and ignoring, for reasons that I never fully understand, ignoring followers, although we can talk about that. So let me take you, I'm going to talk for about, I can't really see that, watch me. I'm going to talk for about a half hour, and that's going to leave us about a half hour for conversation. Okay, so this is really sort of taking you very quickly through the book, but also making some arguments grounded in stuff that is really just a few days old. Key points. The web of leadership. I don't, Lauren gave you a triad just a few moments ago. I actually have a slightly different triad. It's the one I developed for a book called Bad Leadership. It is that there are three things in order to do a sort of mini analysis of leadership. You need to look at the leader, of course, and the context, of course, and the followers. So I call those three strands the thread of leadership, the web of leadership. But instead of focusing on all three, the field, as I said a moment ago, has become fixated on the one out of the three threads. Now, as I said, the reasons for this are kind of complex. I think a lot of it is about money. There's a lot of money to be made by conveying the message that we train leaders. This is something we do. It is, after all, by the way, no surprise that this developed in the United States. It's a capitalist enterprise. It's a leadership industry. I refer to it as an industry. A lot of people now make a lot of money in the leadership field. There is a fantasy that is the man on the white horse, very occasionally the woman on the white horse, that they're the ones that matter, and if you learn how to be a leader, you're going to be not only powerful, but you're going to be successful, you're going to get the biggest office. It's related to success in America, success in the United States, but it is incredibly misleading. And if you're a student of leadership, as I've been for a long time, you have drummed in your head that the leader-follower relationship matters. But you're always taught, as I just said, to emphasize the leader at the expense of the followers. And this is sort of what I did almost all my professional life until I wrote Bad Leadership. I realized when writing that book, you simply cannot do bad leadership without doing bad followership. It just doesn't work. And by the same token, you cannot do good leadership without good followership. So that's the premise on which this book was based. I figured, okay, nobody's really done it, and nobody has. I know Lauren mentioned a handful of other books, but they're basically designed, again, the way most leadership books are designed to tell you how to be a good leader. These other leadership books, and there are only 2 or 3 of them, are designed to tell you how to be a good follower. My book has some of that in it, but it's not about teaching you how to be a good follower any more than I tell my students, I'm here to teach you how to be a good leader. It's about coming to intellectually understand the importance of the role of the follower. And I want to just, it's like make believe you're an undergraduate, and then you'll get kind of the point of the exercise. Now, okay, this is like an immediate problem. How the hell do you find, you all know how many different people define in how many different ways the word leadership? 1 billion. So I realized at the outset, I damn well better define the word followers and followership precisely. One of the things you, I think, have learned when you're writing a paper, and certainly you know it if you're writing a book, you're in control. You can really set the parameters of the discussion. So I wanted to, among other things, break away from the idea that followers are, what's the typical thing that we think of followers as? Sorry? Okay, I didn't hear what you said.
No, if you're a follower, you have no personality.
Yeah, you're a follower. Exactly, you're a sheep. A sheep. That's that we in the United States anyway. We often hear that followers are sheep. You're a pathetic, timid, weak, insipid little wreck, and that's what I want to get away from. I want to get away from that notion. Because as I am defining followers, that is people without power, influence, and authority, they have always mattered than we generally understand, and they matter more now than they ever have before in ways that I'm going to be making clear. So, followers are subordinates who have less power, authority, and influence than do their superiors, and who therefore usually, but not invariably, fall into line. Followership implies a relationship between superiors and subordinates and a response of the former to the latter. These are definitions I put right up front in the book. They're actually in the introductory chapter, not even chapter 1. They're in the introductory section. So I state my claim. These people are in subordinate roles, but please notice they therefore don't have authority. But notice right off the bat, it doesn't mean, by definition, they don't have power and they don't have influence. That's not what a follower, you can be a subordinate with power, and you can be a subordinate with influence. You don't have authority by definition, but you can have the other two, and increasingly people are having the other two. Now, I want to say one other thing. This is how anti-leader I'm becoming, or anti-leader-centric I'm becoming. Throughout this book, if you ever do read it, you're going to notice another relationship that is enormously, I wouldn't say it's underemphasized in the leadership literature, I'd say it doesn't even exist in the leadership literature. Leaders are less important than we usually think they are because a lot of followers pay almost no attention to their leaders. But they typically do pay attention to their peers, to other followers. So a relationship that you guys, if you're going to understand this power dynamic that happens in groups and organizations, it is an incredible mistake, really intellectually a mistake as well, with obvious practical consequences, to think of these people down here and those people up here. Often those people up here are ignored, discounted, whatever, or increasingly, as I will, if I have a chance, we'll get into what are these new socio-political movements, they're simply circumvented. Increasingly, people are taking these matters into their own hands, whether it's about gay and lesbian rights, whether it's about the animal rights movement, whether it's about the green movement, whatever it is. If it isn't being done from the top, people are increasingly deciding, okay, we're going to do it on our own. Okay. You're getting the message, yes? Yes. Is this the next slide? Oh, I don't even want it. I don't know. Should I do this now? All right, okay. The few people who have written about followership, which, as Lauren said, is all of two, really, leaving aside the last edited collection, which has very short little snippet essays. Everyone who has looked, that is, those handful who have looked at the subject, realizes that it's dopey to talk about followers as if they were one sort of blobby mass, just as it would be dopey to talk about leaders as if they're all one whatever mass. So I, after surveying my own universe, again, you're queen of your own book, in this case, 14, I decided to keep it simple, stupid. I divided followers according to only one criterion, that is their level of engagement. You can divide followers in other ways. I'm not saying this is the only way. For example, you can divide them according to how they feel about the leader. Do they hate the leader, or do they love the leader, so forth and so on. For a range of reasons, I divided them only into these 5 different types by level of engagement. So you can look at them now, but I will talk about them more later on. Okay. Okay. Any of you remember seeing this ad?
Yes.
This ad was for 7 years the ad of Audi or Audi, depending on if you're German or not, of America, of this very amazing car. And it sends the message that, as I argue, certainly the leadership field sends, implicitly, if not explicitly. It is a good and wonderful thing, as we said earlier, to be a leader, but heaven forfend, you're a follower. So the message here is never follow, don't follow. Sometimes never follow, because if you follow, you're not going to be worthy of this lovely, who wants an Audi like this? We all want an Audi like this. And if you're going to be worthy of that Audi, never follow. Now, what are the facts about followership? Well, I argue that they have always been more important than the leadership field generally gives them credit for. If you go all the way back to the beginning of time, they have been more important than we generally understand. I also argue that there are some moments in human history, and one can have a wonderful discussion about what makes some moments moments of change. How does this amazing thing happen that in around 1789, roughly the time of the French Revolution, roughly the time of the American Revolution, these two events came together, these two great revolutions, and forever changed the relationship between the leaders and the led forever. Things were never the same after these two great changes in time. Another year you could look at is 1848. Now I see some of our students in this room, and you're not allowed to raise your hand. There are two great publications that came out in 1848. Does anybody know who they are who did not take leadership literacy? You're not allowed to kids who took leadership. Yes?
I don't know. I'm guessing Uncle Tom's Cabin.
Not quite. That was a little bit later, but that's a great exam. By the way, it belongs in leadership literacy. So thank you for it. Happens not to be what I'm thinking of, but it's a great guess. Anybody else? What was published in 1848? Anybody ever heard the phrase "workers of the world unite"? Yes, the Communist Manifesto. Think of the followership implications of workers of the world unite. Think of that. That document, which took a while to make its impression, workers of the workers unite, followers take charge, followers take the lead, followers overthrow capitalists. Something else, 1848, again, this amazing zeitgeist. Do you know that word zeitgeist? It's Zeit meaning, it's a German word for time, and Geist is like spirit. Vaguely, it's a little like ghost, but it means the temper of the times, that something is happening out there. And the other document that came out is Declaration of the Sentiments of the Rights of Women, the great Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony document that is a riff, if you will, not the word they used, a riff, if you will, on the Declaration of Independence, and that's declaring women's rights to be heard. So in this 1 year, you had workers of the world unite, you had women, and in other words, those at the bottom were gradually, over these time, it was roughly a half a century apart, gradually being emboldened. This matters. This matters to how people behave. You can't see leadership in the same way in 1700 as you could in 1900. It's just different. Relations between the governed and the governors, between the leaders and the led, between followers and leaders, are shifted. 1963, again, no leadership literacy people allowed to say. Anybody want to guess what couple of documents I'm talking about?
Letters from Birmingham, yeah.
Excellent, excellent. Zeitgeist, what else came out in 1963? That's one of them. Again, the same year. How amazing is it that these things are big? It's not one was 63 and the other 64. 63. Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique. Yes. The same year. So what's happening? It's, of course, the beginning of the women's movement, the civil rights movement. It's the zeitgeist, but it's the same syndrome that I'm talking about, which is people at the bottom saying to those at the top, I've had enough. I'm planting my flag. I always kid David Gurdon about the phallic implications of him. He's forever planting his flag. That phrase. But this is women and suppressed people, oppressed people, planting their flag and saying, I've had enough. I've had it. It's my time. It's my time. And if you think of that moment in time, it's the same thing. So, in the book, I talk about two changes more recent than any of those. Since the book has come out, which is like all of 2 months, I've actually become enamored of, you know how you write something and you go, oh my God, I'm so clever, I didn't realize it. I've become particularly enamored of one of my two, which I just am stupefied by how important this is, and I will say more about it. For the moment, I'll stick to the two that I talk about in the book, and I give them kind of equal weight in the book. But as I said, I think one is sort of running away with things in ways that even I didn't know a few months ago. So this is the world the 60s made. So I just had a student in my office maybe an hour before I came. It's not a student I've ever had, never been in any of my classes. He's connected to one of you sitting in this room. And he's sitting there for 5 minutes, and he says to me, can I call you Barbara? So what do you think I said?
No.
I actually said yes, which is fine. Of course, those of you who know me a little, it is fine to call me Barbara, but it was the kind of thing, you know, when we think of the changes that have taken place since the 1960s. Can you imagine a student in the 50s and 60s or even 70s coming up to a Harvard professor and in effect saying, "Can I call you Babs?" Never would have happened. Every authority relationship. By the way, how many of you here are non-Americans? Okay, at least a third, if even close to a half, represented at Kennedy School. I am talking primarily about the American context, but not exclusively. Every word out of my mouth pertains to every country from which you come. There are exceptions to some of the statements I make, and we can talk about those later if you like, but I assure you these are global phenomena. Even when I use examples from the United States, they are global phenomena. So at that time, every authority relationship with which those of us who grew up in the 40s or 50s or 60s had been comfortable, whether it's teacher and student. What is your relationship now with your physician, and what would it have been like a few years ago? Now, a few years ago, your doctor was God. It was, he would, or she was typically, of course, a he would open his mouth, he would pronounce on your ailment, and you would go, that's it. Whatever he prescribed is what I'm going to do. Now what do? You go to your doctor, and he or she says what? Says, you've got this and this disease, what do? You go to the internet. You get a second opinion. How many opinions does the internet get? It's not a second opinion. We used to get second opinions. We now get a gazillion opinions. The doctor's voice is only one. All those authority relationships, all this notion of the well-behaved person deferring to the person up there, that changed, and that changed in this era in particular. Now, this is the one about which I spoke a moment ago, the information revolution. I write about it extensively in the book, but I can't tell you how even in the last weeks and months, this seems to be running away, even with my own argument. I think I'll leave it there for now because I want to give you some examples at the very end. The technology, the web technology that we now have enables people to be heard in new and different ways. And above all, it enables people to connect with each other in new and different ways. They don't have to go through any. You want to have a protest? Any place, you don't have to go through any place. You don't have to figure out, geez, how am I going to connect with people at the other end of the city? You can connect with people at the other end of the city or any place else, globally for that matter, with the stroke of a key or whatever. And it is turning out that that capacity is emboldening followers, that is, followers as I am defining it, people without formal authority, so much that leaders are increasingly, instead of setting the agenda, they're increasingly being reactors rather than actors. And again, I'll give you some examples. Okay, a couple of leaders living dangerously. You know, part of my argument is that leaders who used to be nearly untouchable, we want to throw them out now. They give us good cause. This is a guy, you probably know the story, most of you. People didn't like him anyway. There are many examples of, apropos, I'll get to Larry Summers in a minute. People didn't like him anyway. There's a misstep, as there was in his case, some question, no big deal. He was involved with his girlfriends a little bit, financial, who knows, but not a big deal. Within hours, the Staff Association of the World Bank had said the guy has got to get out. Hours, I don't mean days, weeks, months, within hours, they said he's got to get out. So as you can imagine, he says no. You must be kidding. He's thinking, like, they must be joking. Well, they're not joking. And gradually, I described this somewhat in the book, gradually he had no choice. Very analogous, by the way, to Larry Summers. And to many others I could name, by the way. By the way, one other insane mistake. How many of you followed, for example, Governor Spitzer, New York? Almost everybody knows that story. One crazy mistake many of these people make is to leave technological footprints. You know, okay, where's your cell phone records, where's your text, you know, you can be tracked down with some of this stuff. A guy named Harry Stonecipher, anybody know that name? He was the head of Boeing, the CEO of Boeing. He fell in love with a woman in the workplace, made the mistake of sending her passionate emails on the company email, and they were tracked down, and when somebody heard about it, within hours the board said to him, you gotta get out. So if you're gonna screw around or whatever, you might not wanna leave footprints. These two women also, you all know about Carly Fiorino, and there's her counterpart, Patricia Dunn, ousted at Hewlett-Packard. This is such a good case. There's no one here from my followership class. I don't blame them. Why would they want to hear this again? You want to know what's going on with followers in this country and in the world more generally. You can do no better than studying carefully the case of Lawrence Summers, the former president, of course, of Harvard University. People didn't like him very much. One set of words out of his mouth, people pounced on it. Emails would never have happened without email. Faculty, who are not, it's not that they're powerless, but they don't normally run things. They get together and relentlessly, he apologizes 10 times. I'm so sorry, what a fool, I should have never said it, I'm sorry, I was an idiot, I love women more than I love men, they're smart, you know, he tried over and over again to fix it, no fixing it. It was too late. Is it a horse that lets out of a barn? Some animal gets out of a barn, it was too, couldn't put it back in. The inmates took over the asylum, and they pushed him out. And this happens with a frequency that is unimaginable recently. Okay, type 1. Isolates are completely detached. You can all read this, right? They do not care about their leaders or know anything about them or respond to them in any way. Their alienation is never less of consequence. By default, by knowing nothing and doing nothing, isolates strengthen still further leaders who already have the upper hand. This last line is more important than I can begin to convey, because we have the impression, and it applies to the next type 2, we have the impression that people who do nothing, followers, whether in organizations or in a country or whatever, people who stand aside and do absolutely nothing are have no impact. I promise you, they have an impact. The impact is to support the status quo. Don't ever make the mistake of assuming that followers who do nothing don't matter. They do matter. Okay.
I'm sorry.
Yes.
Couldn't that be seen in
You're
another?
interrupting? You're called inviting into What is that? Yes, Tom.
Could they also, the isolates, be seen as not strengthening the hand, but weakening the hand of the leader because they are ballast or the passive aggressive? You know, they're hindering the progress.
You know, a lot of time leaders are very happy to just be quiet. I don't want to hear from you. If I don't hear from you, I can do what I want to do. In a perfect world, leaders engage followers, and they want to align them with their mission, their tasks, and so forth and so on. But believe me, a lot of the time in the real world, leaders are very happy to say, I don't want to, as long as they're not bothering me, it's just fine with me. I can do what I want to do. Okay, I'm not going to go into this simply for lack of time. Type 2, bystanders observe, but they do not participate. There's a difference between the isolate and the bystander. They make a deliberate decision to stand aside, to disengage from their leaders and from whatever is the group dynamic. This withdrawal is in effect a declaration of neutrality, and again, that key last sentence, that amounts to tacit support for whoever and whatever constitutes the status quo. So these are just two pictures. The chapter in the book on bystanders is not on those who are normally written about. Normally, of course, the Holocaust is, or whatever happened in Nazi Germany, is explained through Hitler. Then if you're not looking at Hitler, you're going to look at those immediate, Hermann Goering or Joseph Goebbels or Albert Speer or a host of others. Or you're going to look, there are a few very good books on the actual perpetrators, people who actually did the killing. This chapter looks at a different group altogether, those who did nothing. They went about their business. Here, this is a picture taken, this is the night of this scary pogrom called Crystal Night, when many Jews finally realized, oops, I better get out of here. And most Germans, it did nothing. The bystander, very important player in our collective life. Participants are in some way engaged. I want to read to you something that just came out today. They clearly favor their leaders, and the groups and organizations of which they are members or they're clearly opposed. In either case, they care enough to put their money where their mouths are. That is, to invest some of what they have to try to have an impact. The case I go into in the book is the Merck-Vioxx case. How many, do you all know what I'm talking about? I'm happy. Vioxx is a drug. Merck is one of the great pharmas in the world. Vioxx is a drug that was put on the market in 1999. It turned into a mega, this was the head of Merck. But again, I'm not going to take you through this. Turned into a huge blockbuster drug. Merck is so eager to have the drug that it ignores warning signs, ends up in over 47,000 product, that's just a humongous number, trust me, product liability lawsuits because it was found that Vioxx in some patients caused strokes and heart attacks. Now, two of the stories that I go into at great length, and by great length, I mean they're chapters in the book, happen to be this week big news. This is one of them. You can find on your, if you are interested in Googling it, the Vioxx story is by no means dead, but the point that I make in the chapter is, if you want to understand what happened with Vioxx, you cannot look to the CEO of Merck. Here's where you look. This was a drug developed and driven by Merck's researchers and scientists. They're what Peter Drucker called knowledge workers, people without a lot of authority but with considerable power and influence. And the story of Vioxx is the story of these mid-level people, these experts, these knowledge workers that drove this. The CEO at the time, Raymond Gilmartin, unlike his predecessor, was not a doctor, was not a scientist. He's going wassa, like doesn't even know what's going on, and these people are just driving the drug, including, by the way, ignoring early warnings from the FDA. Okay, am I talking too fast for all of you? Okay. Activists. They feel strongly about their leaders and they act accordingly. They are eager, energetic, and engaged because they are heavily invested in people and process. They work hard either on behalf of their leaders or to undermine and even unseat them. I said there are two stories in this week's news. What do you think this one refers to? What do you think I wrote about in the book that this one refers to? Can anybody guess? What's big and who's visiting? The Pope. I argue that what has happened in the Catholic Church in recent years, particularly I use as a case in point in the Boston Archdiocese, is not about the Pope and not about the bishops, but about dedicated Catholic lay people who formed a group called Voice of the Faithful. Here's, of course, Cardinal Bernard Law. This is a picture of Voice of the Faithful. This story is about activists finally saying we have had enough. Have had enough of cover-ups, have had enough of sexual abuse, have had enough of the church church officials, top church officials, in order to protect the institution of the Catholic Church, ignoring, pushing aside, covering up childhood sexual abuse. And I document this in great detail. It is a follower story. It is not a story about leadership. The leaders were forced to react to the people from the bottom who were saying, and are still saying, something has to change. I'm trying to convey the degree so much of what is happening in the late 20th and the early 21st century is driven from the bottom up and not from the top down. Diehards, last type. Diehards are, as their name implies, prepared to die if necessary for their cause, whether an individual, an idea, or both, and I do mean die, literally. Diehards are deeply devoted to their leaders, or in contrast, they are ready to remove them from positions of power, authority, and influence by any means necessary. In other words, I do not, the types that I define, you can't tell from that per se, whether a participant or an activist or a diehard, is against the leader or for the leader. Sometimes people are willing to die to overthrow a leader, and sometimes they're willing to die on behalf of a leader or a cause, or, in this case, I examined the military. Again, I feel like I'm racing through, but in particular something called Operation Anaconda that was hard on the heels of 9/11. Americans, and it was actually a multinational force, was sent to Afghanistan. These were the leaders. These were diehard officers who were described at some length in the book, that is, officers willing to die. And these were some of the non-commissioned officers, and here's where, among other things, it comes into play that people are willing, sometimes it's not about the leaders and not about the cause, not about the idea, but about fellow followers. And you have descriptions of military people going back into the line of fire, not to rescue a leader, not because they thought long live the United States, but to rescue those they considered in effect their brothers. So the importance of that peer relationship, the importance in our workplace of those who we work with, not necessarily those who we report to, is impossible to overestimate. Okay. You know, I try to come to grips with what does it mean to be a good follower. Here are some of the, you know, simple verities. I guess I conclude that one of the reasons we're all so attracted to leaders and leadership is because it seems to let us off the hook. You know, it's Bush's fault, or it's my manager's fault, or it's the professor's fault, or it's whoever's fault. And if I can put the blame up there, I'm off the hook. And the more I understand about this, we're never off the hook. What happens in this world, again, in our families, in the workplace, wherever, it's up to us. If there's a bad leader and we do nothing about it, we're the ones who are going to pay the price. We get the leadership, in other words, we deserve. We really do. And the fantasy that that person is responsible for our collective good is just that. In my view, it's a fantasy. These are sort of, I guess, three verities. Followers lack authority, as I said earlier, but they do not, or they do not necessarily lack power and influence. Followers who do something are usually preferred to followers who do nothing. Followers can be our agents of change. Now, I'm not quite done. I want to just update you, and I mean as of like 5 minutes ago. I wrote an article recently which I called "The Infinite Impact of Technology on Relations Between Leaders and Followers." You name the technology, and it has the capacity, as I suggested earlier, to change the dynamic in ways that are so new that leaders don't get it yet. It's hardly talked about. I haven't really seen it anyplace else. And so leaders are still constantly being surprised at how followers upend them from literally from 1 second to the next. So let me give you some examples. I'll read to you just a little bit. All in the last couple of weeks or months. There's been a flurry of activity about corporate pay, the pay in particular received by chief executives. That has been one of the hardest nuts to crack. Only now are we seeing, and we are seeing it, by the way, there's a very good book, if you're any of you at the business school, or any of you interested, by a guy, a Wall Street Journal reporter called Alan Murray, and it's called Revolt in the Boardroom. And he talks about how CEOs who until recently, until a few years ago, kind of could do whatever they wanted and their boards let them get away with whatever they wanted to do, those days are coming to an end, have come to an end. Boards pay much more attention. Shareholder activists pay much more attention. CEOs have to be far more cautious about the various constituencies around them. Shareholder pay, as I said, CEO pay has been one of the hardest nuts to crack, but increasingly just this week, there's a whole Wall Street Journal section on how different constituencies are starting to press CEOs to give up some of the enormous dollars they earn. Venezuela, anybody from Latin America here? Okay, hi, yes, I know you. As you know, Hugo Chavez has been called a dictator, a dictator, a dictator. We all know that. Very recently, students had finally had enough. They finally said no. He wanted to change the Constitution to allow him to stay another year. Let me just read you this one line. The traditional method of expressing discontent, that is street protests and so forth, this is in the streets of Caracas, was combined with decidedly 21st century ones as the activists, using my term, although I'm sure not deliberately, used text messages, Facebook groups, and YouTube broadcasts to draw crowds. In other words, the technology being used to expand the size of the crowds, and for the first time in years, Chavez was forced to pull back. How many of you have had any dealings with companies that thrive on, by the way, this is the, I call it the American idolization of relations between leaders and followers. What do I mean by, how many of you watch Dancing with the Stars or American Idol? Anybody? What is that? What is that based on? Or a company called Threadless.com. What is the mentality of all those things?
It's a text messaging.
Who has the voice? Who's making the decision?
Yours.
We're making the decision. Now, on Dancing with the Stars, they have 3 dance experts up there, and they voice their opinion. But then they say, okay, we've heard from the experts, and now we need you to call in. In other words, the democratization, the followerization, the whateverization, because of the technology that allows you to call in, wire in, email in, do what you're voting. Threadless.com, one of many companies that you want to design a T-shirt, you send your design for the T-shirt in, you can vote on the different designs, and that's the T-shirt the company produces. In other words, the consumer suddenly is king and queen in a way we never were again even 5 or 10 years ago. This is the followerization of, if you will, capitalism. Yes?
No, it's true. We overthrew our dictator, Estrada, in the Philippines with texts. We were just for about 2 weeks just texting everybody to gather, and he was in fact overthrown.
You want to give the year?
Of the overthrow. This was about what's it called? 2003, I think. When
Can you send me 2 lines on that?
Right, absolutely.
I'd appreciate it. Okay, Egypt. Headline in the New York Times just a few days. How many of you know who's been sitting in, who's the guy who's been head of Egypt, president of Egypt since time began? A guy, Hosni Mubarak, sitting there for 40 years, unbudgeable. Finally, we get this headline. In Egypt, technology spreading the discontent of workers and so forth. We're finally getting some strikes and so forth and so on. How many of you were inconvenienced by the biggest grounding of American planes in recent American memory? Anybody in this room? But you know about it. You know that American Airlines, in effect, shut down. Do you know how it all started? I'll tell you how it started. The FAA, the Aviation Administration, was letting slide the fact that this should have been done years ago. There was some wiring that had to be checked. The case in point was Southwest Airlines, which until recently was the model airlines in the United States. Best airline, best to fly, highest consumer ratings. But there was a whistleblower at the FAA, a couple of whistleblowers. They drew, that is, these followers, that a whistleblower is a follower, and sometimes a diehard. By the way, it's no fun to be a whistleblower. You almost always get punished. But it's a whistleblower story. Those American Airlines planes, that huge fleet was grounded because of followers. And whistleblowers now have access to a whole range of things they didn't have access to before. My final case in point, because we're going to be living with it for the next several months, is, of course, the Olympic torch relay. Now, I realize I want to turn this over to you, but let me just quickly summarize the leaders who were impacted by the followers. You all know there were these crazy scenes in London, Paris, and San Francisco. And everybody is going, oh my God, we didn't realize. By the way, all of this driven by the capacity of people to organize. Activists have been training, Tibetan activists have been training for this for months and months and months. They knew this was going to be a singular opportunity, that is the Olympics in Beijing. They're training for it for a long time, knowing this is the moment they can make this themselves heard, using, of course, all the technologies that I'm talking about. Let me just run through the leaders who've had to react. Chinese officials, oh my God, now what? Europeans, Gordon Brown has already said, in the wake of these, he's already said he's not going to go to the opening ceremonies. Sarkozy has said, I don't know if I'm going to go to the opening, they're all figuring out, what am I going to do here? All three candidates for the American presidency, Hillary, Barack, and John McCain, they've all had to take a position on this. They're going, okay, we wouldn't come under no circumstances, whatever. The athletes themselves are going, what are our criteria here for should I participate or not? And my favorite example of all is a man by the name of John Rogy. Anybody know who he is? He is the chairman, the Belgian. He's a Belgian physician who is the chairman of the International Olympic Committee. Nice, mild-mannered guy. He was actually selected because he's mild-mannered and nice in the wake of a guy named Juan Antonio Samaranch, who wasn't that mild-mannered and nice, but that's another chapter. So he thinks, oh, great idea. We'll have these Olympics in Beijing. And wasn't imagining what was going to happen. Can I use the shit hit the fan? When the shit started to hit the fan, Raji stuck. This was like 3 weeks ago. He stuck to his original position. He said, it's all fine, it's all good, whatever, we're not going to do anything. He was forced in recent weeks to change his position and is now pushing the Chinese officials to in some way respond to all of this. So all I want to say with this, for those of you who are students of leadership, and this is not, of course, to diminish the importance of leaders. I'm not saying they're unimportant, but I am saying that there has always been a whole other cast of characters that is as important as leaders, and that those of us who want to understand it intellectually or practically, we do a mistake, we make a mistake if we ignore them. And I also want to say that in the 21st century, you will be seeing more and more and hearing more and more about people who are using changes in the culture, changes in technology to make themselves heard, to often circumvent leaders if they don't like, as I said earlier, if they don't like it, they're going to circumvent it, they're going to push it in ways to which leaders have not previously been accustomed. And if you omit that other half of the leader-follower dyad, you do so at your intellectual and practical peril. So that's my argument, or at least it's the argument of this book. Thank you very much. Who wants to fight? I got one woman. She's ready for a fight. A cat fight is what we call it.
Other than the technology factor, is there
I'm sorry?
Other than the technology factors, is there other factors that can promote, as you say, good followers, other than bad followers, that it can turn like inactive people into participants?
You know, I think technology is much of what I do is value-free. I'm not one of to me, the word leadership is value-free. I don't say, oh, to be a leader is necessarily to be a good person. To be a follower means you can be good or you can be bad. I make no value judgments about any of these things. I would say that I think the fixation on leadership has, as I suggested earlier, and we see it in schools, we see it in large organizations, the business, God knows, business schools, has contributed to a culture in which the rest of us feel we don't really have to do anything. And I guess I would argue, and as I argue so often, that step one, before you can take action of any kind, you've got to kind of get it. You've got to kind of understand that you potentially have the power to do something, even if you're not in a position of authority. And you start to get strategic about these things. You figure out, okay, everything's aligned against me. I'm kind of low on the totem pole. How can I create change from where I stand or where I sit? So I guess I would argue that the first step toward encouraging good followership is an intellectual awareness that this stuff matters and not this constant fixation on those at the top. And once we get that, we're going to start to be more aware of our own situation and of the capacities that we potentially enjoy. I never want, as I suggested earlier with whistleblowers, I never make it sound easy. People with authority are a lot more free to exercise various impulses of theirs. But it doesn't mean that those of us who don't see ourselves obviously as in a position of some power, authority, and influence are therefore powerless or influenceless. And the more we begin to viscerally understand this, the more we, I think, will act accordingly. And some of this is a throwback. Those of you who are of a certain age will remember that American schools used to teach like civics courses or citizenship. Leadership, in a way, has become sort of now the new phrase. It's more fashionable than is citizenship. But a lot of this is about being a good citizen, a good corporate citizen, a good community citizen. It is about exercising your right to speak up and to be heard, and to be strategic about it, and to not just assume that what happens is up to them. That's just a big mistake. Yeah.
I was just wondering, using the term leadership, you define it as authority, why not just use the term authority and talk about authority? Because I understand, because it balances with followership,
Yeah.
but it seems like within all of these movements
Have
you're
you
talking
taken
about.
Ronnie Heifetz's course?
No, I haven't.
Oh, God, no, really? You're still saying that? Uh-oh, I'm lost. There are many people, most people in my field, that is the academics, make these constant distinctions. I don't. If you look at, I do a lot of writing, and I now actually blog on a regular basis on the harvardbusiness.org website. And I keep my language very simple. I want to keep my language so simple that anyone who's reading me from anything, I don't want my language to be Kennedy School-esque or Harvard-esque or leadership-esque. I want it to be like the New York Times, like an ordinary newspaper, ordinary whatever. And I find in this room I really make distinctions between power, authority, and influence. But mainly when I write for a larger audience, and I just use the words leadership and followership without getting hung up on values, without getting hung up on the distinctions among the various things.
I guess I asked that more because it seems like all these followerships, the movements of followers,
Yeah.
actually contain a leadership and
You mean within them?
Within them, yeah. And so the organizing component within those.
Absolutely.
I'm just trying to think about
Absolutely.
how to capture that.
It's a great and important point you're making, and what I'm saying isn't against that at all. I'm not saying these are somehow magically, leaderlessly coming together. They absolutely have their own leaders, but they're, if you're looking at Venezuela, they're student leaders. They're just people like whoever, where did this come from? They come out of the woodwork, and the way I'm defining the term here, they are, by my definition, followers. They're people that had no role whatsoever, and that are, however, assuming in some cases the mantle of leaders. But people don't behave very well these days. They just, there's a growing sense of entitlement among people around the world. Even is there anybody from China here? Setting aside the Olympics, I write about this at some length in the book. The activists in China in recent years, China activists. It's like, where is this coming from? Where are they coming from, all these people? Where are these people? Who ever heard of an animal rights movement until recently? Do you know that PETA, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, it is the organization that more people want to volunteer for between the ages of 13 and 24 than any other volunteer organization in the United States. Whoever heard of an animal rights movement? Now, I'm not saying there were no leaders. There's a woman named Ingrid Newkirk who in that particular movement played an important role. But it's like there. And it is alongside it's not the animal rights movement is not anti-anything. It's that leaders were not providing goods and services that people wanted or felt was important. They were increasingly upset by what was happening, and particularly mass farming practices and so forth and so on, and they just took matters in their own hands. And by the way, Wendy's, Burger King, McDonald's, they have responded to animal rights activists. These are not trivial, insignificant, unimportant movements. They're outside the realm of what we study normally in leadership courses, but they're really important, and they are changing the way we live and will continue to live in the 21st century. Yeah.
Perhaps you addressed this in your book, but do you find that in these follower movements there's a different model of leadership? I've had some small-scale experience of being a follower leader, going against trustees at a boarding school.
I'm sorry?
Trustees at a boarding school was our target, and it was interesting. But the point is that we had a kind of a collective leadership style that was very fluid. You know,
Right.
you'd be in charge for a few weeks, and then someone else would sort of knock you off your pedestal.
Nobody anoints you. If
Right.
you're in one of the, no, you've got to kind of earn it.
Right.
And if you don't keep earning it, that's it. You know, it's going to be It's going to be rotating. But that's in a way exciting. And I guess I'm arguing it's the 21st century way, whether we like it or not. It's if you look at, remember those dates I held up, 1789, 1848, 1963. I guess I would put this period right in the next order because the 60s were, as I said, the changing culture. But here it's technology. Here it's technology that, as I say, even since I wrote the book, I'm going almost on a daily basis. I find something in the paper or on the internet or whatever that is supporting the idea that this is just changing the way people relate. It's just, and it's putting leaders in increasingly precarious positions. As I said, if you want a case in point that is in some depth, study the case of Larry Summers. It's really instructive. Harvard had never before in its very long, illustrious history had a vote of no confidence against a president. In this case, the faculty mobilized a vote of no confidence against Larry Summers, and the reason he resigned finally, after, as you know, a long period of trying to hold on, is because he was threatened with a second such vote. And rather than having a second such vote, he said, I'm out of here. Yes.
I'm curious, I've been thinking a lot about this, especially the reaction that you mentioned of the president of the Olympic Committee.
Yeah.
And I've been wondering if he isn't aware of the power of followers and that the decision to put the Olympics in China was deliberate to shine light on this and to give Tibetan activists a stage. And I'm just curious to know your thoughts about that.
I really got your point, Allison. There's no evidence to suggest that at all. I really get your point, and in fact, I did a case in my followership class yesterday. How many of you know the name Paul Bremer? Anybody? Most of you know his name. Oh, okay. Here's one. What a relief. Okay. Paul Bremer was the civilian authority in Iraq right after the invasion. Single-handedly, this is like stupefying. It's a followership case, obviously. As you know now, I'm fixated on the subject. Single-handedly, he made the decision to disband the Iraqi military, which most people argue is the single most important decision that explains the subsequent debacle in Iraq. By the way, many people divide Iraq into two separate kind of ways of thinking. One is the initial decision to invade, which received wide support, and the second is the aftermath. Paul Bremer took it on himself, and I'm thinking of it, Allison, because somebody yesterday came up with exactly what you came up with, which is, isn't it possible, because the story is that Bremer gets to, he's never even been in the Middle East. Within days after coming to the Middle East, he makes this decision, which not only does he make more or less single-handedly, it is in violation of the policy that had been decided on earlier, which is to not, at least not entirely, disband the Iraqi military. And he sent a note to Rumsfeld and Feith being Rumsfeld's deputy, and they kind of say, okay, it's kind of just whatever. So somebody yesterday raised just the question that you raised, the sort of vaguely conspiracy question, which is, didn't Rumsfeld and Bremer have a secret agreement to do this? Could Bremer possibly have done this without Rumsfeld's prior approval. And I can only give the same answer that I just gave you. There's no evidence of that whatsoever. It's rather that Rumsfeld had a billion things going on, Rumsfeld didn't pay attention, and he gave this guy, who, as I said, had never set foot in the Middle East and who'd been there days, authority to disband the military of between 500,000 and 800,000 men. So, and I would say the same, there's no evidence. Ruggie, or however you pronounce his name, is a relatively mild-mannered Belgian physician who was getting far more than he ever bargained for, and I don't think he understood any more than did Chinese officials, and any more than did we fully. You know, we're looking at this and going, oh my God, is the Olympic, it'll probably happen, the Olympics probably will happen. I think there's too many vested interests in every aspect. But it's precarious, and this we're going to hear about Tibet and Darfur more in the next few months than we've heard in the last few years. So I can only say, Allison, I don't know. I can't say with certitude, but you look for evidence, and I have not. Yes.
Well, in regards to Paul Rama,
Yes.
That doesn't mean I agree with his decision, but he was here, and that question was asked here. And the way he talked about it, they would be involved against them or work against them, and that would be the And he said, how can you discuss it?
Yes. That's what. No, look, he's come out with a book since then, and he defends it and so forth and so on. But this is now very well documented. By the way, I had a student write a case about this, and I don't know how many of you were avid readers of the New York Times, but about 2 weeks ago, there was a front-page article on just this issue, written by Michael Gordon, who's the Times military expert, and it's dissecting this very case, the most important decision made with regard to the whole Iraqi war, and it was made virtually single-handedly by Paul Rama, or whatever he said. He gives a variety of excuses. By the way, I'm not particularly blaming the guy. It's not his, you know, it's if they're not paying attention or sufficient attention, so he makes a decision. So, yes. Sorry, I don't know all your names. Yes.
I'm Sarah, and I had a question about what are kind of the boundaries of followership. So when do followers actually move into what you define as leaders? And the example of PETA is one, or in this country and other countries, organized labor.
Right.
I mean, is that, are they still, do you still define them as followers, or is there a certain point where?
The answer is that I honestly don't get hung up in those distinctions. If you were a student of mine and you did a case study of, let's say, the animal rights movement, and you said, this is when so-and-so, Ingrid Newkirk, or any movement or anything, really stopped being a follower as you're defining it and moved into a position of leadership, I would say fine. You know, that's all fine with me. I don't, as I said, I try to keep it simple, stupid. I mainly want to make the point that people that we don't normally think of as having any impact are having a lot of impact and have always had a lot of impact. And if you want to say to me, after a certain amount of time and success, this person really does, or these people really move into leadership roles, Godspeed, fine. I don't cling to this stuff. This is all fungible. This whole, you know, one of the reasons I've stayed in this field so long is because it's like, whatever, you know, there's no, this is the answer and there's no other answer. This is how you define leadership. You can define leadership any way you want to define it. Just tell me how you define it so I know what you're talking about. In this case, you can make them leaders 5 minutes later. You can argue if you have a follower starts off, begins something, and they then get one person to go along. If you tell me that makes them a leader, I'm going to say fine. It's okay with me. So I don't get too worried about that stuff. Yes.
So building on Sarah's comment, I think an interesting political example would be MoveOn.org.
Yes.
You know, I mean, from the small sleepy hamlet of Berkeley, these people have grown.
I wonder why she's particularly
interested. I don't know.
Yeah, really small, really sleepy. Yeah.
But it's really impressive. We have a mid-career colleague, Matt Wilson, who's done a lot of work with MoveOn, and talked how MoveOn really pushed the tide in the 90s, in the 2004 election. I'm really doing lots of 2006 election. And that to me was really a stunning realization about the intersection, both of your view of the technology improvements and the sort of political will of great numbers of people who can be motivated and mobilized through that medium.
Right. I just want to make one piggyback comment on this matter. As you all know, in this country, the question has been raised, if everybody's against Bush and against the war in Iraq, why haven't there been protests? Like, where is everybody? The downside of technology, the downside, one of the downsides, is that much of this energy is being moved through it. People will sit home, I can type in on my rage. I don't have to go outside, I don't have to leave the kids, I don't have to not go to a movie. I can type it all in. And a real question now, Thomas Friedman, the writer for the New York Times, has called this generation of college student undergraduates the Q generation, the quiet generation. Why aren't they protesting this and that? Why are they so well behaved? One of the explanations that those of us who look at these things come up with is they're doing stuff, but they're doing it on their computers. So does that have the same now? It's a different story. You can't compare Iraq to Vietnam. Vietnam, there was a draft, all of that stuff. We know there are profound differences. But it's still kind of striking that in such an anti-Bush, whatever, anti-Iraq war, we've heard quite little about protest. There have been some, and the media, by the way, often underplays them. That's another conversation. But it is absolutely possible that technology can take some of those energies away from people, and they can be alone in their room rather than in another room organizing, and that could be seen as a downside. I think we still know quite little. Yes.
Now, would you just reconcile that comment with the Obama phenomenon of young people on college campuses getting actively involved in the political process?
Yeah, I see Obama as, by the way, totally bottom-up candidacy. I mean, Hillary was, what was the word? What's the word? Inevitable. A year ago she was inevitable, and now we have Obama. So I see that as a thank you for making the point. Yeah, yes, you're absolutely right. They're getting out, they're mobile, and it's a great thing. I'm saying, why? Though, where is the anger at some of the other stuff?
But I mean, I'm like, at the same time, they got 1,500,000 donors who've given $200 million. It's completely revolutionizing the whole political process. So I mean, there's energy that's expressing itself in activism.
Totally agree. I've written about this. By the way, he has made early on brilliant use of the web and raises these large sums, as you are pointing out. They're generally contributions under $100 from lots of different people. Hillary Clinton, did not get the power of the web and has repeatedly made mistakes with regard to using the internet. So it's a great, great case in point. But I think you asked the question in part about student mobilization.
About activism.
About student activism and physical engagement.
Yeah,
I think partly your point was that they physically come out.
Right.
And I think it's a great thing, but that's, I think, in large part his magnetism. In other words, they're not going out to protest. Yeah, but he's a leader of our. By our, I don't mean I'm for him or against him. I mean we created him, as you are pointing out, and he is totally a phenomenon of young people, but using technology in new and creative ways, the way it's never been used before. By the way, that's going to be one. How did Obama use the internet to get within 1 year from whoever heard of Barack Obama to possibly the next president of the United States? Okay, well, I think we're probably just about done, and I thank you very much for coming. And yeah, so followership. I kid my students, those few bold ones who dare to take a course on followership, and I say, now, did you come to the Kennedy School to learn how to be a follower? And the answer is no. And I say, well, what are you doing here? This leadership thing has gotten out of hand. It's like I'm sort of biting the hand. Can you all see me? Or do you want me to? Is it okay? I'm sort of biting the hand that feeds me. But underlying my presentation today is the supposition that the leadership field, which in its current incarnation is about 30 years old, that is, Machiavelli did leadership, and Plato did leadership, and Lao Tse did leadership, but in its modern incarnation, this fashionable stuff, is about 3 decades old, and I really have reached the conclusion that we have become leader-centric, fixated on leaders and ignoring, for reasons that I never fully understand, ignoring followers, although we can talk about that. So let me take you, I'm going to talk for about, I can't really see that, watch me. I'm going to talk for about a half hour, and that's going to leave us about a half hour for conversation. Okay, so
before I talk a little bit about Barbara here, I wanted to say we know a number of you will have to leave at 1 o'clock for class, or some maybe closer to 1:30. That's fine. You can just slip out as quietly as you can. We're videotaping this for posterity. So thank you very much. You know, the current theory of leadership involves a triad: leaders, followers, and a shared cause. And yet, as recently as several years ago, when I was doing an article on followership and checked at the Baker Library, Harvard Business School, there was a total of 2 books extant on followership. Robert Kelly's a book on followership, and then Ira Chaley's. And now here, Josie Bass, knowing that Barbara's book was coming out this past February, rushed into print another book authored by 3 people, including Ira Chaley, on the art of followership. So, Barbara, your people are watching what your research agenda is. It's really this grossly ignored leg of that stool, of that triad. So Barbara's contribution is very significant. Barbara, as you all know, is the James McGregor Burns Lecturer here at the Kennedy School. She was also the founding executive director of the Center for Public Leadership from 2000 to 2003. Then for 3 years after that.
This is really sort of taking you very quickly through the book, but also making some arguments grounded in stuff that is really just a few days old. Key points. The web of leadership. I don't, Lauren gave you a triad just a few moments ago. I actually have a slightly different triad. It's the one I developed for a book called Bad Leadership. It is that there are 3 things in order to do a sort of mini analysis of leadership. You need to look at the leader, of course, and the context, of course, and the followers. So I call those 3 strands the thread of leadership, the web of leadership. But instead of focusing on all 3, the field, as I said a moment ago, has become fixated on the one out of the 3 threads. Now, as I said, the reasons for this are kind of complex. I think a lot of it is about money. There's a lot of money to be made by conveying the message that we train leaders. This is something we do. It is, after all, by the way, no surprise that this developed in the United States. It's a capitalist enterprise. It's a leadership industry. I refer to it as an industry. A lot of people now make a lot of money in the leadership field. There is a fantasy that is the man on the white.
She's been our research director, and now she serves as our eminence brune here at the center. Blonde. Okay, right. She's held lectureships at a variety of different universities: Fordham, Tufts, Fairleigh Dickinson, George Washington, and Uppsala in Sweden. It has also been Dean of Graduate Studies and Research at Fairleigh Dickinson, and then also at the Center for the Advanced Study of Leadership at the Academy of Leadership at the University of Maryland, and was also the driving force behind the founding of the International Leadership Academy Association, the preeminent professional association of folks involved in leadership studies. So it is Barbara is a treasure here at the Center for Public Leadership, and so it's a delight to have her speak about this book, which is the most recent in the joint imprint we have with Harvard Business Press on leadership for the common good. So, Barbara.
Thank you very much. A poor woman. She's never been at one place for more than a few years. Okay, so let me see here what you guys can see. Well, first of all, those of you who won books, you don't have to read it. You stay here another hour or so, you don't have to read it. Horse, very occasionally the woman on the white horse, that they're the ones that matter, and if you learn how to be a leader, you're going to be not only powerful, but you're going to be successful, you're going to get the biggest office. It's related to success in America, success in the United States, but it is incredibly misleading. And if you're a student of leadership, as I've been for a long time, you have drummed in your head that the leader-follower relationship matters. But you're always taught, as I just said, to emphasize the leader at the expense of the followers. And this is sort of what I did almost all my professional life until I wrote Bad Leadership. I realized when writing that book, you simply cannot do bad leadership without doing bad followership. It just doesn't work. And by the same token, you cannot do good leadership without good followership. So that's the premise on which this book was based. I figured, okay, nobody's really done it. And nobody has. I know Lauren mentioned a handful of other books, but they're basically designed, again, the way most leadership books are designed to tell you how to be a good leader. These other leadership books, and there are only 2 or 3 of them, are designed to tell you how to be a good follower. My book has some of that in it, but it's not about teaching you how to be a good follower any more than I tell my students, I'm here to teach you how to be a good leader. It's about coming to intellectually understand